First, I'd like to thank our sponsors. We got a grant from the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity through the Champaign County EDC and Tim at the SBDC. We also have gotten sponsorship from the Research Park, the Beckman Institute, and the Office of Technology Management. What we're going to do is go through kind of the basics of SBIR to get started, and then Roland's going to talk more about the cost proposal preparation part of this. Why am I up here and what do I have to do with this? I started out up here at Beckman as a grad student, ended up starting a company called Caviton. We got SBIR funding from the Air Force, the EPA, the Marine Corps. We also did projects with Honeywell, Department of Energy, DARPA, and the Indiana Department of Homeland Security. We did a pretty good job of getting SBIR funding for several years. When that company folded, I started a consulting company called Cogent Innovations, which is who I'm representing today. Through Cogent Innovations, I have worked with a company called Andalize in the Research Park, where I was the VP of Engineering. We got SBIR funding from NIH, NSF, EPA, broad agency announcement from the US Army. So I've got a background in finding SBIR funding, identifying topics based on technologies, and I've worked with a wide range of these agencies that put out SBIR funding. And I also do SBIR technical assistance through the Research Park and have helped close to 50 companies with proposal preparation and project management type things. Through this workshop, I will also be available for consulting services to help people figure out how to get funding. My outline, first I'm going to talk about the SBIR and STTR programs and the differences. A little bit of an overview of the participating agencies, how to go about finding relevant topics for your technology, what you need to do to get started. This is a process that takes a little bit of time, so the sooner you get started before proposals are due, the better off you'll be. Talk about writing and submitting proposals, and then talk about some of the common reviewers' comments that we've seen over the last couple of years. The SBIR and STTR programs were legislated to fund early stage research and development for small technology companies. This is to stimulate technological innovation, increase commercialization of federal research and development, increase small business participation in federally funded R&D, and foster participation by minority and disadvantaged firms in technological innovation. These are the participating agencies. The Department of Defense is by far the largest, putting in over $1 billion of research money into the SBIR program. There are 5 agencies that participate in the STTR program, which is linking research institutes to small businesses. And you can see there's quite a bit of money available out there for proposals to get funded. Health and Human Services includes the National Institutes of Health and the CDC. Different agencies have different ways of giving awards. The contracting agencies usually establish plans, protocols, and requirements. The topics are highly focused. This is how DoD and NASA do things. They have more fiscal requirements. They're a little more technically challenging, I think. And those are kind of the groups that do that. The granting agencies include NIH, Department of Education, NSF, USDA, and Department of Energy. Usually that's an investigator-initiated approach, so you come to them with an idea in one of their broad topic areas. They can help you a little bit more in the granting process, and usually have more flexibility in how the proposal is carried out. There are lots of differences between the agencies. They've tried to make this so there aren't so many differences, and I think in that process they've made it so there are more differences. So whenever you do one of these, you really need to do a little bit of homework first and understand something about the agency and how things work. Some of them have lower funding levels. They cover a really broad range of topic areas. The different organizations have different numbers of solicitations and timing of the solicitations throughout the year. Proposal preparation instructions can be very different. The submission process can be, some of them are very similar and some of them are very different. The type of award, whether it's a grant or contract, can be different. The review process varies between all of these organizations, and I'll go through some of that. Your odds of receiving funding are very different based on the organizations, and the funding mechanisms are different. On the funding mechanisms part of it, I think when you go to propose to a certain organization, you should understand how they pay you, because you may find out that it takes a lot more money to get or a lot more time to get your money than you would think, or you may get all the money right up front and then it's real easy to deal with. So we'll talk about some of those situations. The STTR program is set up to do technology transfer from universities to small companies. The participating agencies are Department of Defense, Department of Energy, NIH, NASA, and NSF. The odds of receiving funding in the SBIR program. In phase one, they vary by agency, but it ranges from 10 to 20% success rate when you're writing proposals. So I think one of the things to keep in mind is if you're going to try and go down this path, you better have thick skin, and if you don't succeed at first, you need to keep trying. It can be a hard process, but it can also be a rewarding process because it's non-dilutive funding, which is always a wonderful thing. I think the average right now across all of the agencies is about 12.5%. The good news, on the other hand, is the chances of getting a phase two proposal are much higher, closer to 50%. And in fact, we did some research out at the research park and looked into the companies that are out there, and they have had an 80% success rate going from phase one to phase two. So if you get the small amount of money in the phase one and you put your work in and you do a good job, you have a good shot at getting the big money in a phase two. Of course, all this funding depends on the budget and the number of proposals submitted. Key differences between SBIR and STTR. SBIR permits research institution partners, and STTR requires research institution partners. And they have defined percentages for how much work has to be done by each organization, and the funding is always awarded to the small business.
Dave?
Yep.
Previous slide, just to clarify, those are max numbers that you give. The outsource is not an expected 33%, that's maximum that you can out.
That's correct. Eligibility, the definition for small business is fewer than 500 employees, must be organized for profit, so not-for-profits can't do this, must be at least 51% US owned, and there are now changes where you can allow VC-funded projects and companies, but some of the agencies aren't following that right now, so it's another one where you have to do a little bit of homework if you're planning on getting a bunch of VC funding before you go into the SBIR process, or if you've already done that. All of the work must be performed in the US. The PI, or principal investigator, has to be employed greater than 50% by the small business for SBIR. STTR, they can be primarily employed by the nonprofit partner or the university. This is now a hard, fast rule. You cannot have another full-time job. We used to find ways to make it so you were 51% employed by the business. They won't allow that anymore, so you really need somebody who's running the business to be applying for PI and an SBIR. It is not. The requirements are that you certify that you will be greater than 51% employed at the start of the project, throughout the project, and at the end of the project. So you can't just say you're full-time for 3 months and that's enough. They just will not allow it now from everything I've been told. And that's all pretty recent. I mean, there were a lot of companies that did things in interesting ways to make it so they were 51% employed, but you really need somebody. Their whole goal is to have you start a company, not be a professor that's paying for their grad students. They want business development out of this. The small company in an SBIR has to do at least 2/3 of the effort for phase 1 and at least half the effort for phase 2. So you can outsource a bunch of things, but you can't outsource everything. You need to be doing the bulk of the work. On an STTR project, you have to do at least 40% of the effort in the small business. And like I just said, these requirements apply at the time of award and for the duration of the project. Phase 1 for an SBIR or STTR is a proof of concept or proof of feasibility project. And it's important to keep in mind that you scope it so you can show them that in 6 months for $150,000, you can prove that this is a feasible idea that is worth pursuing as a business. They range from about $80K to $150K. It varies quite a bit still between agencies, so it's important to understand that. Phase 2 is a full research or research and development effort, up to $1 million, sometimes up to $1.5 million for 2 years is kind of standard, and $750,000 for STTR. They have what's called a phase 3. Phase 3 is not SBIR funds, it's some other way of funding more development. Department of Defense does this fairly regularly. There are mechanisms like a phase 2B that are used by some of the agencies too. So there is a chance at follow-on funding after phase 2, but for the most part, it's really just a phase 1 and a phase 2 project, in my experience. The standard phase 1 process, they solicit topics, you put in a proposal, they evaluate that proposal, and it leads to a phase 1 award if you are successful. Improving your odds, I think number one is the innovative part. I think most of the proposals that I've seen get rejected, and I've seen quite a few of them, the easiest way for them to reject it is to say that project just isn't innovative, and we've seen similar things before, and it's just not that good. You need credibility as a researcher and as a company. And so if you're, a two-person company and one's a professor at the university, you need to do things to make it look like you're a credible company. And that can include things like business advisors and scientific advisors, and there are ways to make it look like you're a little more credible. One of the things that I've heard as a comment before was if somebody's email address is a Gmail address instead of the company's address, it's a red flag and they know that you don't really have a company. And so simple things like that make it like you're a better company. You need to understand the agency's missions and needs and really write the proposal to make sure that you're helping the agency, not just helping yourself. Unsolicited proposals are not accepted, so you need to find an appropriate solicitation. You need to follow all the rules in the submission packet, or they can just reject it on an administrative level, and I'll talk about that in a minute. In certain cases, you're allowed to call the program manager or technical point of contact. You should understand those rules, and if you are allowed to contact them, you should contact them. And you should contact them and listen to what they have to say and make sure that you are responsive to those comments, because it makes a big difference. Agency differences in funding levels. Phase 1s are usually 6 months, and they vary between the agencies. Phase 2s are up to 2 years. Some are 18 months, some are 2 years. Some of them aren't a whole lot of money. EPA was $225K the last time I got one. It's $300K now. With NSF and NIH, you are allowed to propose up to 150% of the maximum. So even though the maximum is $1 million, you're allowed to propose $1.5 million. and they aren't allowed to ding you for that. So from what I understand at this point, you should always just go for the 1.5 million instead of the million. But I would also talk to my contract officer before I did that. Agency differences in whether you can contact them. Department of Defense, what they do is they put out a pre-solicitation 2 months before the submission date. And then for 1 month, you're allowed to talk to your technical point of contact directly. And you should take advantage of that situation. Then the following month, that's right up to when the solicitation is ending, you are not allowed to talk to them directly, but you are allowed to submit questions. If you submit questions this way, all of your competition is seeing those questions and answers. So it's really best to get in touch with them early.
But for Department of Defense SBRs, are there any restrictions on how you use the technology afterwards?
On how you use the technology afterwards? So there are lots of topics where they will say it's ITAR regulated, and so you have to follow those regulations. But for the most part, you can do whatever you want as long as you aren't doing it in one of those countries where you're not allowed to. So, but that's another one where you can discuss it with whoever it is and make sure that you want to. But for the most part, they're hoping that you have some other use other than their use. Not that I've seen. Roland?
Well, the government retains a royalty-free license to use the technology, but part of the beauty of the Sbir Sttr program is that the IP retains in the control of the small business. So that's a key point of the program. If you're proposing and you get one of these proposals, you retain control of the IP.
But the government has like first access, like priority, like.
No, all they say is that if you sell this product to the government, you're not supposed to charge us to use it. That's technically the way the law works. However, if you, in practice, it's so hard to trace. If you're selling a product, some derivative product to the government, it's so hard to trace who really owns it that the government often does not end up charging you for it.
Alan?
There are some marking strategies from an intellectual property perspective, and there's language that varies from agency to agency. But the game is that you try to make sure that the government only gets rights in stuff that's paid for, and have enough IP also in other areas and market accordingly so that the government gets what it likes to have. And then the goal would be to end up being the sole source provider to the government. And probably the only other party who might undercut them would be maybe somebody who's not subcontracted to, because they would really understand. And so there's kind of a seminal case that was decided that dealt with this issue. So if you appropriately mark, then hopefully the IP strategy would be to end up being able to be a sole source provider to the government, if the government is going to be a customer, so that they can only buy from your company.
Here's the question on that. On the intellectual property aspect of it, then would you want to patent it to make sure that it's 7-year law?
Certainly, pursuing patent protection is something you want to carefully evaluate and weigh the cost of, and certainly patent protection is
Yeah, and for the most part, you can't use SBIR funds for patent protection, so you need to find another way to do that. And you can do things like using the fee to help offset your patent protection costs. And the federal government also, at least through the DoD stuff, says that if they want to, they can have somebody else manufacture whatever you're making. So if you have a wonderful invention, but you can't scale up and they need it in wartime or something like that, they'll just take it. But I've never heard of it happening, but that is in there.
So outside of the likelihood of just getting the SBIR, should you really care which agency you're getting it from? Are there differences after the grant?
Yes. There are actually pretty huge differences between the agencies. I kind of mentioned the funding mechanisms. So if you get a contract from Department of Defense, You do 30 days of work, you submit an invoice, they've got 30 days to pay your invoice. But you're supposed to be spending that money the whole time, so you're already 2 months behind before you get your first payment. Whereas like NIH will put all of the money for the phase 1 in an account and you just draw it down as you go. EPA, you submit invoices every month and they pay 85% of the invoice and they keep the rest of it till after you submit your final report. And then NSF gives you 2/3 of the money up front and 1/3 when you complete your final report. So it gets pretty tricky, and you should understand that, because I've had lots of clients recently who I tell them that, then they get funded, and then they say, how are we supposed to do this if we don't get the money for 2 months? It's like, well, that's why we talked about this before, but.
But you're right, the strategy of the potential customer is one thing you would consider, because the DoD is likely to buy your product if it's something they want to use.
Correct.
The NIH really isn't likely to buy your product in bulk once it's on the shelf. So that would be a strategy that you want to think about in determining which agency to go for, which one might end up being a customer in the future.
So if the government's going to be a customer, going to be a.
Right, right. They're a lot more likely to buy your product than the other agencies.
Laura?
I just wanted to mention that the research park has developed a partnership with the University of Illinois Employee Credit Union. This is a little bit further down the road, but for gap funding, to help cover gap funding between SBIR phase 1 and phase 2. So we recognize kind of what Dave just says. Well, I've got money from phase 1. I'm waiting for my phase 2. It could be 6 months in between or whatever. How do I keep my company afloat? So we've developed some strategies to address that. Of course, it's not for pre-phase 1, but
Right.
phase 1, phase 2, and that's something we're happy to talk about.
Good point.
Sorry, another question.
No problem.
What are these agencies actually getting out of this? Outside of, you had some bullet points up there about, encouraging new businesses, blah, 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 but,
Right. So this was something mandated on them, and sometimes they don't even like having to do this. They're required to spend a certain percentage of their research money on small business development. So this was developed for the small business, not for the agencies.
So what is the motivation for them to, pick the right companies? Like, do they get evaluated by somebody? Or?
I think they get evaluated by their bosses, and so that's why you need to understand what their mission is. And so if you apply to the NIH and you're applying to the Institute on Aging, you better have a proposal that's talking about aging, not something else. So I think they are evaluated, they are required to spend this money. We hear from the program managers regularly that they have more money than they can spend and they don't get good enough proposals. And so that's why we try and work real hard with people to make sure you put in a proposal that's worth putting in, because you've got real high likelihood of getting funded if you've got a good, innovative idea and you put in a good proposal.
Well, Dave, in the bigger picture, technology innovation is highly risky, right? So the government wants to subsidize that to reduce the risk and incentivize entrepreneurs to step out into the market and bring innovations to market. That's the crux of it, is it's a way,
Right.
It's just a new channel, relatively new channel for government funding for innovation.
And how are they evaluating how effective this is? They just look at how many small businesses they generate?
Dave is the expert on that.
Yeah, so what happens is after you get a few of these, you have to put in commercialization reports. And so if you've got, I think, 3 phase 2s from Department of Defense, they start looking at, did you actually commercialize this? And then, so what they're trying to do is make it so you don't just keep getting phase 1s and phase 1s and phase 2s and never turn into a company, because really what they're trying to do is economic development.
So if you get, say, like some SBIRs at some point and it doesn't work out, then maybe in a future application that could potentially hurt you?
Yes. I'm not sure I've seen it actually happen, but there's certainly that threat there. Laura?
Yeah, I just want to mention that's kind of what propelled the genesis of the I-Corps program. So the National Science Foundation found that many of the SBIR grants it was awarding were never getting commercialized, or mainly that people were building really cool technology that had no commercial application, or that not necessarily didn't have a commercial application, but maybe it's 10 years out, or maybe that commercial, so it's not available, there's no market for it, at least at this point. So what this I-Corps program does is it's a boot camp almost, it follows the lean startup principle. So it's having the entrepreneurs or potential entrepreneurs who may be receiving NSF SBIR funding to go and talk to their customers and figure out what their commercialization strategy might be before they ever even get the money. So, and that program does have a small stipend with it as well.
Yeah, I'm in that program right now. It's really cool.
Good.
Actually, if I could add a little bit onto that, what the agencies get is their research goals met. The basic concept is that these late agencies with large federal R&D dollars have to do certain research. That's why the federal government is funding them. The federal government says, we're going to take a small percentage of your research budget and require that small businesses do some of that research. And so the main two foci of the program are, number one, you have to address the research goals of the funding institution. That's why Dave keeps saying, you've got to know the research goals of the institution. Secondly, it has to be commercializable. And even now, you still see those two thrusts primarily that must be addressed in all your proposals.
Yeah, and the commercialization part of it, Roland and I were talking earlier, has become a much bigger deal the last few years,
Yes.
and it's really important that you understand how to commercialize this because
You know those goals, Dave mentioned the solicitation, that's where the agency advertises its research goals. It'll say in the solicitation, these are the areas where we need innovation, where we need ideas, where we need technologies. You have to address those goals in a way that leads to a product that's also commercializable.
To kind of piggyback on what you're saying, I used to do appropriations at the federal government level. There was a big movement about 15 years ago where there was a lot of fraud that was going through in these individual applications. So they have tightened down on that because of that. For instance, the members of Congress used to, you lobby them, you would get money specifically earmarked in an agency budget. There were a lot of checks that were going out of the country in Swiss bank accounts. So that's another reason they're asking for you to show and prove you are a viable asset in the United States. You're a small business, and that you actually are under that umbrella of what the grant is asking you to be really careful about what it says. For instance, if there is a specific location, specific budget, and then prove again, like he was saying, that it's marketable, because they're just not going to give money out anymore.
Is that happening with SBR or just in general?
Just in general.
it's definitely a focus of the SBIR process, though. I mean, fraud, waste, and abuse was a huge focus of the last conference.
Who are these people that do reviews, like what backgrounds do they have?
That do the reviews of the proposals?
Proposals.
That varies by agency, and I'll run through some of that. Again, the agencies have different deadlines, and so you need to kind of monitor when things are coming out, when things are due, and make sure you get started early. The submission process varies a whole bunch between all the agencies. Some go through grants.gov, NSF goes through Fastlane, so you need to figure out the submission process and how to do it. I've always thought it was funny that the EPA requires 10 paper printed copies of your proposal. They're the only ones that require that.
They really are moving forward, though. You also have to submit a CD-ROM now. You mail it in.
Yeah, amazing. The review process. When you submit these, the first thing they do is an administrative review, and they look to see if you've followed the page limitations, the font sizes, the specified elements in order. And they use this as a way to screen out people who didn't put enough effort into their proposal. Make sure you don't miss any of these rules. I've seen people submit 15 minutes too late, and then they're surprised that they don't get funding because they were cut out as an administrative review. It's really important to go through the rules and follow them. They aren't that stringent, but I've seen lots of people not do it, and it's just not worth it to waste your time proposing if you're not going to do it right. And have somebody else review it to make sure that you've really done this right. I mean, it's worth your time. I've seen way too many where I'm the first person to review it, and there's tons of grammatical and spelling errors, and nothing makes sense. It's just, don't submit it if you're not going to put some effort into it and do it right.
Or a story on the deadline. It makes a difference whether the guidelines say local time
Yep.
East Coast time.
It sure does. And they vary.
You submitted a proposal in that hour thinking it was the local time, but it's actually East Coast time, and they were rejected.
Yep. Yeah, Roland and I have seen a lot of this stuff, so use us as resources. We can help a lot and save a lot of time with a lot of these issues. Again, get to know the agency. If you can talk to the program people, they will tell you whether you've got a good idea or, well, they won't tell you you don't have a good idea, but they'll just give you kind of a generic answer saying, make sure you submit something that's innovative. But they can really help you, and sometimes with NIH, I've done things where I thought I had the right technical point of contact, and I called them up, and they said, that's not really what I like, but I've got a friend over here who really does that kind of stuff, and they get you in touch with the right people. So it makes a big difference to get in touch with these people early. And I think I probably hit on that like 15 times during this. The review process, USDA has 4 to 6 reviewers. NIH uses academia and industry reviewers, so does NSF. Phase 1 and 2 have technical and commercial reviewers for NSF. So everybody does this a little bit differently. Duplicate proposals. You can send your proposal to different agencies and different topics, but you can't get it funded by 2 different agencies. So if you get NASA and Department of Energy interested in your technology, you need to tell them that you've gotten another award and you can't accept both of them. You can submit multiple proposals related to a platform technology as long as the projects are substantially different. And I would recommend if you did this at this point, you set up 2 totally separate experiments and make it very clear that these are different things, so it's easy to defend if somebody comes in and says, we want to make sure you're doing something different. Key differences between SBIR, STTR, and other research proposals. These have to have commercial potential, and I mean, I don't know how many times we'll mention that, but it's really critical. You need to understand the market space. You need to understand the state of the art of the technology. I've seen lots of them get rejected by saying there are better ideas out there that we've funded in the past. And so you really need to understand what's been done and who's doing what. Your goal should be a product or a service, not more research or publications. It's just a different approach than academic grants. The impacts can be financial as well as scientific or educational. And once you go to a phase 2 application, it's going to require a detailed commercialization plan. I think there are several of us around that can help you with those too. It's kind of a learning experience, although if you're going through the I-Corps program, that's a real nice way to get started. Potential benefits to the researcher. Why would somebody at Beckman Institute want to do this? It can provide financial rewards for the researcher if you start a company and it's successful. It can strengthen the researcher's lab program and reputation. It allows you to attract innovative employees. It can support university research programs and strengthen industry relations for your lab. The company can then fund university research, so the money can come back into your lab if you have a postdoc that goes off and starts a company and wants to bring in more research into the company. Can obviously strengthen the local technology community, as we've been talking about. It also gives you recognition of patents and copyrights, and can also fulfill the university tech transfer charter. So it makes a lot of people happy if you bother to get these. Searching for topics. This is an interesting topic to me because a lot of my experience has been taking a kind of a raw technology out of the university and finding applications for it and turning it into things. So for the most part, if I ever did keyword searches and relied on that to find topics, I would have never gotten any funding. So when I go through these things, I go through all of the topics and read them all and try and figure out if I can find things to fit whatever the technology I'm working with is. There's a site, zin.com. It lists all of the solicitations that are currently out. It has links to all of the solicitation or all of the agencies. It's a really good site. You can do keyword searches on it, but again, I think if you do a little bit more in depth, you can get more information, find better topics and more applications. So I've mentioned a couple times that you really need to get started early on these things. There are parts of this process that can take up to 6 weeks lately, and so you really need to get started early. Most of the agencies are electronic submissions, so you have to go through a series of things to be able to do that, and some of the registration steps can be slow. The first thing you need to do is form a business entity, and Alan Singleton's a great person to talk to about that, who's been making comments in the back. He's an IP and business attorney here in town out at the research park. So the first thing you need to do is get a tax ID number. This is required. It didn't used to be. After you get the tax ID number, you need to get a DUNS number. Once you get the DUNS number, you have to register in the system for award management at sam.gov. They supposedly will turn them around in like 48 hours, but I've seen 2 companies take 6 weeks to get through this process. So it's important to get started early, and hopefully it goes through fast, but these are all things that you need to get a number from the first one to go to the second one, and so it's an iterative process. None of it's hard, it just can be time consuming to get registered. And then you need to register at sba.gov, which is a new requirement, and it's another one that only takes a couple minutes, but you have to have all the other information before you can do it. And then you need to register with whatever the agency's relevant website is, and those are all different, and you can find those in the solicitations. Does this mean you have to form a company? Yes. It used to be that you could put in an application and you didn't need to have the company until the award was granted, but now since you need to have the tax ID number and the DUNS number and all that stuff, you have to set up the company. It doesn't have to have any significant operations, and we've seen several people set up a company that was just going to do something if they got the award. But you have to remember that credibility is a big deal here, and so if you're going to set up a shell of a company in the hopes of getting SBIR funding, you ought to put some thought into where that company is going to be located, what the address is, whether you have a website. I know that reviewers will sit in that room and go look for your company website and look at your email address and things like that. So it's important to get pretty well established, just because credibility is a big thing nowadays. Electronic submission tips. Servers get busy near the deadlines. This isn't the problem that it was 15 years ago, but it's still a problem, so try and submit early. Be prepared for hiccups. It's inevitably you will have problems with your submission, so if you do it a week ahead of time, we can help you straighten that out, and if you do it last minute, maybe we can help you out. Be sure that you've been registered at all of these things. Don't wait till the last second to do it. I like to prepare the proposal as a single document in Word and then put it all together as a PDF to upload it. All of the agencies do things a little bit different though, so it's good to familiarize yourself. If you're going to submit to NSF, go into Fastlane and understand what the sections are and how they're divided up and how long they are. Yeah, and download the application instructions early and keep them, because sometimes it's hard to get into the websites as it gets closer to. Okay, why are proposals rejected? Number one reason is always perceived lack of innovation. You really need to prove that this is an innovative idea, and I think sometimes I've even seen some ideas that aren't necessarily that innovative, but if the proposal's written well, you can prove that it's innovative. And I've also seen some proposals where the technology was incredibly innovative, but the proposal didn't really get the point across of why it's innovative. So key thing in your proposal is prove that this is an innovative idea. I think the number two reason that I see always is that you're proposing to do way too much work for 6 months and $150K. And I mean, I think almost everybody I see, the first couple that they write, they just way over scope it, way over promise. And that's a real common way for them to get rejected. You need technical detail in the work plan. You need to prove that this is a good idea. And if you don't have enough technical detail, they won't really know how you're going to do this. You need to adhere to the proposal guidelines. You need to be responding to a topic that makes sense. Lack of knowledge of prior work or state of the art is another big one. Lack of credibility. If you haven't really defined what your facilities and equipment and all that stuff are and who the people are, they'll reject it because they really want to know that you're the right people to do this job. Poorly written proposals. If you're not going to put the effort in to write a good proposal, it's not worth submitting it. Missing deadlines happens regularly. I see it. It seems like every deadline there's somebody who submits it an hour after they were supposed to. And inadequate phase 2 or phase 3 potential. One of the things I like to do when I review these is make sure that not only do you understand what you would do in phase 2, but you convey that to the reviewer. Because you don't want to do the whole project in phase 1, the big money's in phase 2. So you really need to scope it in a way that you understand how you're going to show that this is a feasible idea, and then what you're going to do after that for the 2 years and $1 million. Again, do your homework. This is, you really need to, yeah?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No problem.
One thing, like you're saying, the differences between the different agencies, you don't know who's reading them. It could be an academic who understands acronyms, but it may be just a staffer who came on a poli sci. I used to have to read applications from Fermilab, from PhDs from Harvard, and let me tell you, that was real fun for somebody who has no background in that, and I was really decisions. So I guess from my standpoint as a former reviewer of sorts, is to write it in the technical language, but also be mindful of the person that you may be reading it may not be as technical as you may want them to understand.
Yeah, I think that's a real key point, and it's one that's coming up. But Department of Defense can really get you on this one because it may be somebody incredibly technical that's reviewing it, and it may be somebody who is not technical at all. So make sure you spell out acronyms, make sure you make it a clear understanding of what's there, but you also have to have the technical detail.
Do you have any idea of like the technical skill of your reviewers ahead of time, or is it just like
Well, I think it depends on the agency, because if it's NIH or NSF, you know that it's going to be professors at universities that are reviewing it, and so you better put the care into it that you would put in an academic paper. DOD, you have no idea. EPA, you really have no idea. So, I mean, I think there's a real art to writing something that's understandable to anybody, but also has the technical detail in there that you prove that it's a feasible idea.
Is it still professors that evaluate commercialization potential?
Sometimes. And sometimes you get the reviewer's comments back and it's obvious that it's a professor that just has no grasp of what the business side of this is. And there's not a lot you can do about that. So again, it's an art to prove that this is a good idea. And with that commercialization plan, it better be believable. It doesn't necessarily have to be right, but it has to be believable and has to be clear enough that a professor can read it and go, oh, that's a really good business idea. Fund it.
If it's rejected or even if it's accepted, they give you feedback on it.
They do. You can ask for feedback. Some of the agencies give it to you automatically. Some you've got to send in an email. Some of the reviewers' comments are incredibly helpful, and some of them are just shockingly bad, and you have no idea what they actually read because it wasn't your proposal. I sent one into NASA once, and it got rejected, and the reviewers' comments were obviously for a different company and a different proposal. And I called them up and said, hey, these aren't our reviews, and they said, well, it doesn't matter, you didn't get funded. So. Yeah, I mean, use us as resources, because some of us have done this a whole lot of times, and some of us have made just about every mistake you could ever make. So, you know, don't, go ahead and lean on us.
I just wanted to say that in addition to the gentlemen here who are a wealth of knowledge and from a counseling standpoint, also talk to other people who've done it. And we have plenty of them out at the park and in enterprise firms, and they're very willing to share
Right.
their experiences and what they've gone through and the lessons they learned.
Yeah, and next Friday at noon, we're going to have a panel of 3 companies up here that have done it, and you should come see that. I think there's a lot of neat experience in this community.
I think too, when you're doing the application and having whatever the, product that you're trying to get the approval for, having it noted with, an entity that is known is more, apt to be looked at than not. For instance, if you're doing it through the buyer, whatever program you're going to, that's the first thing they look for. So if it's not a known entity, they're gonna, these Google searches are gonna, it's gonna be twice as much research that's gonna cause them to want to step back versus step forward. That makes sense.
And do you know how they choose these, so for NIH or stuff, how do they choose the professors that are evaluating this?
I'm not real familiar with that process. I think it's just like peer-reviewed journals. They go to people that should be in the same field and have them read through it. You hope that you don't get a competitor reviewing it. I just saw one of those that I think was clearly a competitor that really rejected it, and the other 2 reviewers thought it was a great idea. I mean, some of it's difficult. You have to have thick skin and keep trying.
And for NIH, they actually lean on the proposers. There's a spot in the proposal application
Yeah,
where you can suggest reviewers.
Yep.
And there's a spot where you can say, please don't have such and such review because they're a competitor, they've got a special interest or something.
Yep. I think we've covered almost all the key points, but I'll go through them real quick anyway. Make sure you read through the solicitation. Understand that you have competition. Don't say there is no competition out there. If nothing else, your competition is the status quo, and you need to understand that because new technology is not easily adapted against the status quo, if nothing else. You need to prove you're innovative. The term that I hear thrown around is you need to make sure this is not an incremental increase to an existing technology. This has to be innovative. And so when you present it, you need to make it clear that this isn't just a little bit of an advancement. This is, yep.
Can you give an example of what would fall under like sufficiently innovative versus incremental?
Well, so I think that's hard because I don't think there's a clear definition. I think it's how you write it. And I really think it's in the words, not necessarily the technology, because almost any technology is going to be an incremental increase. But you need to show why this is a great business idea, not just a technical neat thing, right? I think that's the big deal, is how do you show that this technology is worthy of starting a company?
In that case, can you give an example of one that just failed? Like they gave you the feedback back that, or they gave whoever the proposer was, it wasn't innovative enough?
Boy, I think half of the ones I've seen rejected were because it wasn't innovative enough. One of the ones that I just looked at was a medical device that I thought was a pretty cool idea, but the reviewer said there are so many other ways to do this that this isn't innovative. And I think the whole point was if they wrote it the right way, this would have clearly been an innovative solution, but they didn't really distinguish themselves from the competition. And so then it's just an incremental increase in an existing technology. And I think that's really what you need to do, is differentiate from somebody else's technology, show that you understand what's out there, and show why this is a great idea. Why is this innovative and worthy of funding?
Well, here's an example. There was a firm that I was working with in New York, was proposing to NIST. This is a firm that made facades for buildings. And the facades need to be resistant to bombs and explosions. That's getting to be more and more important. So that there's a certain measure of how resistant it is now. And they were proposing a technology that could make the facade 10 times more resistant to bombs. And so that's what they proposed to NIST. And NIST said 10 times more resistant, that's an improvement. That's not like a major, huge difference. And that's a great example of where it wasn't innovative enough. Definitely an improvement, but not a huge contribution to the science or to the art, state of the art.
And I would guess if you,
Like 10x is a order of magnitude.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so,
That wasn't enough of a contribution, and looked to them like, well, you know, we're progressing this way anyway, you know, the field is moving forward, we're gonna achieve 10X. This is not a huge innovative difference.
whereas I would guess if you went and looked at the proposal and thought about the technology that they were using and you wrote it in the right way, they would go, oh, wow, so this is going to improve it by 10x, but has the potential to do 2 orders of magnitude.
Right.
You know, so I think it's all in how you present it, and that's the trick to writing these.
It sounds like it's so subjective anyways. I just like so many papers, and it depends on reviewers you get sometimes.
Well, I think that's true, and that's something to keep in mind, but I also think it's true that, you know, I've brought in about $3.5 million for companies that I've worked in doing this. So even if it's a little bit subjective and kind of hard to do, it's real, non-dilutive funding that helps you start a company, and it's cash in your pocket. And I think in some ways this is a really neat program. I just think it's important that if you're going to bother to do it, you give yourself the best chance to win. And that's what we try and help people do.
One question is the potential reviewer who might be your competitor. So do we have a channel that we can claim that, well, we don't like this reviewer, that they potentially steal our technology?
Yeah, I think NSF and NIH, you can do that.
Yeah, it's explicit in those agencies. They say, please let us know who should not review.
Yeah.
Yeah, you said NIH previously, but it's also NSF.
NSF too, yeah, I should have mentioned them as well. Suggested reviewers is one of their
Well,
sections of the
if they
proposal.
they don't give you the formal channel, you can kind of, in some way, to write the proposal, kind of implying this is our competitor. And it's not explicitly, but implying some implication that those companies are competitor.
I've certainly seen proposals where they are explicit about who the competition is and why you're better than the competition. And so I think there are ways you could write the proposal to increase your chances of doing well. I think they also do their best to make sure that they're getting honest reviewers that aren't going to be your competition and stealing your ideas. I think everybody's trying to make this a successful, clean program that makes things better. But you know, I think whenever you're putting your ideas out there, even if it's marked as proprietary and everything, there's some chance that.
And are you expected to give like a huge level of technical detail so that someone could be like as much as an addict?
Yeah, so this is if you have proprietary information, you have to mark it as proprietary. You're not allowed to mark the entire proposal proprietary. So you need to pick what the proprietary parts are and label those pages as such. I think you don't want to give away all of your secrets if you don't have to, but you also have to provide sufficient technical detail that they understand what the project is and why you're doing it. So I think that's another one where there's a little bit of balance there. Yeah, Laura?
I'm just going to say that I think that your comments just then are applied to lots of things, not just SBIR
Right.
proposals. And we see this with our entrepreneurs at Enterprise Works all the time, that how much information do I give when I'm talking to a potential investor, or how much information do I give when they're sending us applications?
Yeah.
You know, at the university, a lot of our documents are subject to the Freedom of Information Act. So there's all kinds of,
Yep.
this comes up over and over and over again. It's a really good skill to have.
Yeah,
To be
and
able to describe what you do without giving away your secret sauce.
And I'm sure Alan has different answers to this and how you should protect it too. But just from my experience, when I started doing this, I was paranoid and wanted non-disclosure agreements before anything was ever talked about, and I was hiding all of our detailed stuff, and I think that can hurt you real bad, but you also get hurt if they steal your stuff. Did a project with a large Fortune 500 company, and they eventually just said, we don't need your technology, we're just going to do this on our own, and there wasn't really anything we could do about it. I think for the most part, big companies aren't going to do that because they want to rely on you because you're innovative and agile, and I mean, it's all a balance, and it does happen that people steal your ideas, but in my experience, everybody wants you because you're the expert, so they're going to leave it in your hands. And, you know, they're more than happy to buy you out because that's way cheaper than trying to fight a court battle. But it is a balance, and it's something you have to learn, and everybody gets their own style, and everybody gets their own comfort level. I'm working with a couple companies right now that are young people that just finished their PhDs, and they won't tell anybody any of their ideas, and they're out trying to get venture capital funding. And a venture capitalist is not going to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and they have to understand your business idea or they aren't going to give you funding, but they don't necessarily care about some of the technical details. So you can kind of craft things the right way and let them know what you're doing without letting them know what you're doing.
I think too, to kind of piggyback on that too, is kind of finding a happy medium between being, you want to get, like you were saying, give enough detail to where they understand it, but not so much detail that you're outwardly being hired. So it's the big they get a hold of that proposal that they wouldn't be able to kind of copy it per se and be able to do that from there. And also with that too, you had mentioned as far as like the phone interviews and possible interviews once we get through that first preliminary screening is to be able to communicate your, not just the project on the written, but be able to orally do it in which you're practiced enough, you can answer questions and give, you know, a 3-minute, 5-minute segment about what it is and what you want to accomplish.
Yeah, and I don't mean to present it in a way to make this daunting or overly intimidating. It's just when you're writing the proposal, you have to understand who the reviewers are and who you're explaining this to, and make sure you do a good job of explaining why it's innovative without necessarily giving away all the details. I think it's all a balance, and it's a challenge, but there are ways to do it, and it can be a really fun way to run a business for sure.
Did you ever find out who the reviewer was?
Yeah, I think NIH, you can find out who the reviewers were. Department of Defense, you're never going to know anything. Well, I mean, if you get the award, you're probably going to have a meeting with them and you'll find out who they were, or at least I have. But I think that all varies too.
With DoD, as far as like security clearance and everything on the contracts, do they list out if there's a security clearance that's required to apply?
I don't think I've ever seen one that had a security clearance requirement. There are some things with Homeland Security and DoD that I've seen where they won't disclose a lot of the information, so they're kind of vague. And I think usually those, if you read it carefully, you can figure out what they're getting at, but they don't kind of explicitly tell you what this is for. But yeah, for the most part, you aren't allowed to do things that have security clearance involvement. I think all of these have been hammered. Commercialization plan used to not be a big deal. It's getting to be a bigger and bigger deal every year. And certainly when you go from a phase 1 to a phase 2, you need to deeply understand your commercialization plan. I think a lot of this is all about credibility. If you're a one-person company, you have to make it look like you're going to be a successful company. You need to show that you have facilities, and if that means you have an affiliate agreement with the research park, so you have an address at the research park, that's a pretty cheap way to add some credibility. If you have a scientific and business advisory board, that gives you credibility. Do things that make it look like you're going to be a successful company and you're the right people to do this and you've got an innovative idea. I think that's pretty obvious, but it's a little bit different for academics that are used to writing proposals in academia. This is more of a sales document than it is an academic treatise. Attention to detail, have somebody read the proposal, know the page limits, submit on time. So in writing a proposal cold, without knowing the technical point of contact, without having any contact with them ahead of time, It happens. I've gotten several proposals funded where I never talked to the people, but it doesn't happen near as often as if you've had lots of communications with the people and you understand who they are and they understand who you are. So don't be scared to call these people. That's what their job is, and they're happy to help you and make it so you don't waste time throwing in proposals that aren't any good. Yeah, remember this is a sales document, not an academic publication. Don't exceed the page limit or word limit. I mean, go through all this stuff and make sure you've done it right and have somebody else check it. First, you need to demonstrate the significance of the problem and what difference your efforts are going to make and what are you going to produce. The proposed solution needs to be defined, and the team has to have the expertise and resources to commercialize the idea. These are the sections of the proposal. Those are all listed in the solicitation. Avoid jargon, spell out acronyms, double check spelling and grammar. I mean, just kind of the standard stuff in proposal preparation. Put the same effort you would into an academic paper. These are all just kind of style things. And then I think Roland's going to talk more about cost proposals. And I think we've gone through all of these. I think that's pretty much it for me. Here's my contact information if you want it. You can get in touch with me through Tim at SBDC or through Laura at the Research Park. I do consulting through the SBDC through this program, so I can help you guys out if you need to at no cost to you. I also do SBIR technical assistance through the Research Park at no cost to you. And Roland and I are also iStart providers, so if you go through the iStart program or you want to look into the iStart program, you can use us to help you out through that also. Feel free to email me with questions or call me with questions, and I'd be glad to help you with any of this stuff if you want to put in a proposal, and hopefully we can help you win. And with that, I'll give it up to Roland to talk about cost proposal preparation.